A lone figure stands before the Roman Senate, a crimson robe draped over his shoulders. He dismisses a warning as mere superstition, a scene immortalized in a dozen films. But how much of that iconic moment is grounded in truth? We are about to peel back 2,000 years of legend to confront the real Julius Caesar. By the end of this journey, you will possess a clear understanding of the man who shaped history, separate from the Hollywood myth. We will investigate his calculated rise to power and ask why his most famous love affair was really a strategic alliance. The legend is familiar, but the man is a mystery. What part of his story surprises you the most? That lone figure in the Senate did not simply appear from nowhere, fully formed and draped in power. The real Caesar was forged in fire, decades before that fateful day. He entered the world in the year 100 BC, born into a prestigious patrician family whose name echoed with ancient glory. Yet their coffers were nearly empty. This contrast between a great name and little money would define his youth, creating a burning ambition that no movie has ever truly captured. While films show us the emperor on his throne, they skip the hungry young man who had to build his fortune from almost nothing. His first brush with death came early, a terrifying encounter with the dictator Sulla. The young Caesar was on the proscription lists, sentenced to death, and only escaped through a frantic campaign of bribes and pleas from his mother's powerful connections. He was pardoned, but Sulla issued a grim warning, stating that in this boy there were many Mariuses. It was a prophecy of the turmoil to come, one the young Caesar never forgot. He then left Rome not in disgrace, but to begin a calculated military career in Asia. There, a story is told that he captured a group of pirates who had taken him hostage. He participated in their games and conversations, all the while joking that once freed, he would return and crucify them. And he did exactly that, a chilling demonstration of the cold, ruthless calculation that would become his trademark. This entire formative period, filled with near-death experiences, shrewd political maneuvering, and a relentless drive for status, is the crucial context Hollywood omits. We are shown the summit, but never the treacherous, cunning climb. That cold, ruthless calculation from his youth is almost never our first introduction to the cinematic Caesar. We meet him not as a desperate young climber, but as a figure already enthroned in power. Think of the 1953 film Julius Caesar, where he simply appears, a statue come to life, surrounded by adoring crowds. His first lines are delivered with a booming, godlike authority. The HBO series Rome gives us a similar archetype, a man so entrenched in his command that the world bends around him as he walks. These introductions are masterclasses in establishing an aura. They show us the effect of power, but they skip the cause. They give us the gravitas-laden dialogue and the dramatic entrance, compressing years, even decades, of intricate political maneuvering into a single, powerful visual moment. It is a brilliant narrative shortcut, sacrificing historical nuance for immediate dramatic punch. We understand instantly that this is a man to be reckoned with, but we learn nothing of the reckoning he himself had to perform to get there. The real Caesar spent years building alliances, courting popular favor, and amassing a personal fortune to fund his ambitions. His rise was a slow, deliberate chess game, not a single triumphant walk through the Roman Forum. The movies present a finished monument. The history reveals the relentless architect, laying one political brick at a time. So why does this cinematic framing matter so much? Because by starting the story at the peak, we miss the entire, treacherous slope of the mountain. We are left to wonder, what did that climb truly cost the man who became the legend? That relentless architect finally faced a choice that would define him forever. In the year 49 BC, Julius Caesar stood on the northern bank of the Rubicon River, the small stream that marked the boundary of Italy. As a proconsul, a provincial governor, he commanded legions, but Roman law was absolute. No general was permitted to bring those soldiers across this river and into the heartland of Italy. To do so was not a political maneuver, it was a blatant, undeniable act of treason. The political context was a pressure cooker. Caesar's enemies in the Senate, led by his old rival Pompey, had finally maneuvered to strip him of his command and his legal immunity. They left him with two options. He could return to Rome alone, a private citizen, almost certainly facing exile or a politically motivated trial. Or he could cross the river with his one loyal legion, the 13th, and declare war on the Roman Republic itself. This was not a power grab born of simple ambition. It was a desperate gamble for survival. The risk was absolute. He was outnumbered and out-resourced. Pompey commanded the loyalty of nearly every legion and the entire treasury of Rome. Failure meant not just his own death, but the annihilation of his supporters, his family name, and his legacy. It was in this moment of supreme tension that he reportedly uttered the famous phrase, "Alia acto esti." The die is cast. It was an acknowledgement that there was no turning back, that the course of events was now in the hands of fate. With those words, he gave the order to advance. The crossing of that shallow river was the single most consequential decision of his life. It immediately plunged the Roman Republic into a brutal civil war, a conflict that would tear the ancient world apart for 4 bloody years. This was not a glorious march of conquest, as sometimes depicted. It was the moment a citizen chose to break his own republic to save himself, setting a precedent that would echo for centuries. Hollywood transforms that desperate gamble into a quiet, soul-searching soliloquy. The cinematic Rubicon is a moment of profound internal struggle. We see Caesar alone on the riverbank, perhaps under a stormy sky, wrestling with the moral weight of his decision. The camera closes in on his troubled face as he contemplates the future of the republic he is about to shatter. It is powerful, personal, and almost entirely invented for dramatic effect. This portrayal frames the crossing as a deeply philosophical choice. A man wrestling with his conscience and his destiny. The real event was far less solitary and contemplative. Caesar was with his 13th Legion, a force of thousands of hardened soldiers. He was a general on the move, not a philosopher king pausing for reflection. The decision had already been made through a complex calculus of political survival. His enemies had backed him into a corner, and crossing the Rubicon was the only move left on the board. By focusing so intently on a fictional internal moment, films shift the narrative. They present the act as a personal, almost tragic choice, rather than the cold, logical culmination of a political war that had been raging for years. This cinematic liberty makes for a more compelling character study, but it obscures the raw, pragmatic reality. The real Caesar was not a man torn by doubt on a riverbank. He was a brilliant strategist who had already weighed the risks and found the alternative unacceptable. So we must ask, why does this dramatic framing resonate so deeply with us? Perhaps because it is easier to understand a man wrestling with his soul than it is to comprehend the ruthless, calculated logic of a political survivor who saw no other path to survival. And this simplification of a complex man extends far beyond the banks of a single river. That ruthless logic was honed and perfected far from Rome, in the misty forests of Gaul. For 9 long years, Julius Caesar waged a war of conquest that would become the true crucible of his power. A campaign far more complex and brutal than the simple phrase "Veni, vidi, vis" I suggests. "I came, I saw, I conquered." This famous boast, sent to Rome after a swift victory in Asia Minor, paints a picture of effortless dominance. But the Gallic Wars were anything but effortless. This was a grueling, 9-year struggle against dozens of disparate tribes, across a vast territory encompassing modern France, Belgium, and parts of surrounding countries. The scale was staggering. Ancient sources, though debated, suggest the conflict resulted in the deaths of 1 million Gauls and the enslavement of another million. This was not a series of glorious battles. It was a protracted, bloody process of subjugation. Caesar's strategy was a masterclass in combined arms warfare and relentless logistics. He used the formidable Roman legions, with their disciplined formations and advanced siege engines, as an anvil. But he also used Gallic cavalry as a hammer, often recruiting tribes who were rivals of his current enemies. He built 2 massive bridges across the Rhine in just 10 days to intimidate Germanic tribes, not for permanent conquest, but as a shocking display of Roman engineering and power. His approach was often systematically brutal. When a tribe rebelled, his retribution could be absolute, sometimes resulting in the execution of entire tribal councils or the mass enslavement of a population. This served a dual purpose. It crushed the immediate spirit of resistance, and it sent a terrifying message to any other tribe considering defiance. But beyond the battlefield, Caesar was waging another crucial war, the war for public opinion back in Rome. He understood that his political future depended on his image. To manage this, he became his own master propagandist, writing and publishing his commentaries on the Gallic War. These were not dry military reports. They were gripping, first-person accounts designed for public consumption, portraying his campaigns as a noble, civilized mission to bring order to a chaotic and barbaric land. He presented himself as a brilliant, decisive, and always just commander, a necessary bulwark for Rome. The reality, of course, was far messier. He often provoked conflicts to justify his continued command and his need for more glory. The Gallic Wars made Julius Caesar in 2 profound ways. First, they gave him an immense personal fortune from plunder and the sale of slaves, wealth that would bankroll his future political ambitions. Second, and perhaps more importantly, they forged the 13th Legion and others into a fiercely loyal personal army. Men who owed their riches and their lives not to the distant Roman Senate, but to their general alone. The man who crossed the Rubicon was not just a politician with soldiers. He was a warlord returning home at the head of a battle-hardened, personally devoted army, his coffers overflowing with gold, and his reputation carefully manufactured by his own pen. This was the real foundation of his power, built not in the Roman Forum, but on the blood-soaked soil of Gaul. The silver screen transforms that 9-year crucible into a breathtaking and deeply misleading spectacle. We are shown vast Sigil legions, moving in perfect unison against chaotic hordes of blue-painted warriors, a clear visual metaphor for order clashing with chaos. The complex political landscape of Gaul, a patchwork of shifting tribal alliances that Caesar expertly manipulated, is flattened into a simple binary. The civilized Romans stand on one side, and the barbaric, screaming tribes stand on the other. This cinematic shorthand makes for an easily understood conflict, but it erases the intricate diplomacy and blatant opportunism that were central to Caesar's strategy. He was not just a conqueror, he was a political puppeteer, constantly playing one Gallic chieftain against another to weaken his enemies. The films, in their quest for visual grandeur, almost universally omit his most brutal acts. Take the fate of the Germanic tribes, the Usipetes and Tencteri. According to Caesar's own account, he agreed to a truce with their leaders, only to launch a surprise attack while their cavalry was away. His legions fell upon the defenseless tribal camp, slaughtering men, women, and children. He then pursued and destroyed their returning cavalry. It was an act that shocked even some of his contemporary Romans for its perfidy, a blatant violation of the rules of war. This event, and others like it, find no place in the heroic narratives of most films. They are inconvenient truths that complicate the clean, epic story of Roman glory. By turning a protracted, politically messy, and often monstrous campaign into a series of glorious set pieces, cinema performs a profound simplification. It gives us a conqueror we can comprehend, a leader of men in shining armor, while carefully editing out the warlord who ordered atrocities to cement his control. This sanitized version begs a deeper question. What does this cinematic cleansing do to our understanding of power itself? And if the reality of his public wars is softened, what happens to the story of his most private alliance? But the alliance that would truly reshape the Mediterranean world began not on a battlefield, but in a royal palace in Alexandria. The story of Caesar and Cleopatra is often sold as one of history's great love affairs, a tale of passion between a powerful Roman general and an exotic Egyptian queen. The reality, however, was a masterclass in political survival. When the 21-year-old Cleopatra first sought out Caesar, she was a queen in exile, ousted from power by her younger brother. Caesar, meanwhile, was in Egypt pursuing his rival Pompey, only to find himself embroiled in a messy dynastic dispute and dangerously outnumbered. Their legendary first meeting, where she was supposedly smuggled into the palace, rolled inside a carpet, was not a scene of seduction, but one of desperate, clever audacity. She was presenting him with a bold solution, a political partner who could secure Egypt and its vast wealth for him. He saw in her not just a captivating woman, but the key to stabilizing a wealthy, grain-rich nation that was crucial to his war effort. In return, she saw in him the military might necessary to crush her brother's forces and reclaim her throne. Their union was cemented not by romance, but by a shared, urgent need for power. He used his legions to fight her civil war, and in return, she secured the resources and a loyal allied kingdom at his back. This was the foundation of their relationship, a cold-blooded deal wrapped in the language of alliance. To see it as merely a love story is to miss the entire, ruthless point. Their partnership was a strategic merger, the ancient world's most consequential corporate takeover. Cleopatra soon followed Caesar to Rome, not as a hidden mistress, but as his honored guest, living in a villa just across the Tiber. Her presence was a political earthquake. Romans watched with a mixture of fascination and deep suspicion as this foreign queen, with her son Caesarion in tow, walked among them. She was a living, breathing symbol of Caesar's growing power and his perceived drift toward Eastern-style monarchy, a concept that horrified the traditional Roman aristocracy. The birth of their son, whom she named Ptolemy Roman 15 Philopator Philometor Caesar, but who was known to everyone as Caesarion, or Little Caesar, was the ultimate political statement. It was a dynastic claim, an attempt to fuse the bloodline of the Roman conqueror with that of the Ptolemaic pharaohs, creating an heir to two worlds. For Cleopatra, it was the ultimate insurance policy for her kingdom and her lineage. For Caesar's enemies in the Senate, however, it was their worst nightmare made flesh, a vision of a future where Rome itself might be ruled from Alexandria. This so-called affair was never a private matter. It was a very public, highly calculated partnership that altered the balance of power across the known world, proving that the most dangerous alliances are often forged, not in war councils, but in the quiet of a royal chamber. Hollywood fell in love with the idea of Caesar and Cleopatra long before it cared for the truth. The silver screen transforms their hard-nosed political merger into a whirlwind of epic romance, where politics is merely a backdrop for passion. We see Elizabeth Taylor's stunning Cleopatra, a vision in gold and coal, meeting a world-weary Caesar played by Rex Harrison. Their every glance is charged with a destiny that feels more personal than political. The camera lingers on their intimate moments, framing their alliance as a grand, inevitable love affair for the ages. This cinematic choice makes for breathtaking drama, but it fundamentally misrepresents the nature of their bond. By focusing on the whispered conversations and longing looks, films downplay the brutal reality. This was not a couple drawn together by fate, but by a mutual and desperate need for power. The real Cleopatra did not secure her throne through charm alone. She secured it by offering Caesar the one thing he needed most in that moment: the vast resources and strategic stability of Egypt. He did not restore her out of affection. He did so to install a reliable, indebted ally in a critical region of the world. The political calculus is the engine of their story, yet Hollywood consistently treats it as a subplot. This romantic framing has a profound side effect. The modern image of Cleopatra has been shaped far more by the actresses who have portrayed her than by the historical accounts. Elizabeth Taylor's iconic performance did not just play a queen, it defined her for generations. That image of a sultry, seductive, and impossibly glamorous ruler has buried the reality of a shrewd, multilingual intellectual and a ruthless political survivor. The real Cleopatra was a strategist who spoke multiple languages and governed a complex kingdom. A woman who used every tool at her disposal, including a partnership with Rome's most powerful man, to ensure her survival and that of her dynasty. The cinematic version reduces her agency, often making her a prize to be won or a tempestuous lover whose decisions are driven by emotion. This simplification does a disservice to both figures. It turns Caesar from a calculating statesman into a man swayed by a pretty face, and it turns Cleopatra from a masterful politician into a legendary beauty. Why does this romanticized version persist so stubbornly? Perhaps because a grand love story is easier to sell than a cold-blooded alliance. We prefer the legend of two souls drawn together by passion, even when the history tells us was two brilliant minds united by a shared ambition for ultimate control. And this tendency to soften the hard edges of history extends beyond his personal life, right up to the most famous moment of his death. That calculated alliance with Cleopatra only deepened the fears of his enemies back in Rome. The conspiracy to assassinate Julius Caesar was not a sudden outburst of rage, but a meticulously planned political operation. At its heart were two men with very different motives. Gaius Cassius Longinus was the driving force, a man with a personal grievance and a deep-seated hatred for the idea of a single ruler. He famously believed that Caesar's ascent meant the end of their own political careers and the death of the Republic itself. Then there was Marcus Junius Brutus, a man caught in an impossible conflict. He was not only Caesar's distant relative, but had been personally favored by him, even being named in his will. Brutus was an idealist, a student of philosophy who believed he was sacrificing a friend to save the Republic from tyranny. Cassius preyed upon this idealism, constantly reminding Brutus of his legendary ancestor, who had driven out the last king of Rome centuries before. The conspiracy grew to include over 60 senators, a broad coalition united not by friendship, but by a shared fear of Caesar's permanent power. They called themselves the Liberators, a name that reveals how they saw their own actions. They planned the murder for the Ides of March, the 15th day of the month, because the Senate was scheduled to meet that day in the theater of Pompey, a location away from Caesar's loyal guards. The plan was for the entire group to surround him, with each man delivering a single stab wound. This was not just about killing him. It was about making every conspirator equally guilty, binding them together in blood. They believed this collective act would be seen not as a murder, but as a justified political execution. The reality of the assassination, however, was far from the clean, noble act they had envisioned. As Caesar took his seat in the Senate chamber, the conspirators crowded around him. One man presented a petition, pulling at his robe to create a distraction. Then the first dagger struck. What followed was not a solemn, orderly stabbing. It was a frenzied, chaotic, and brutally messy attack. Dozens of senators, many of whom he considered allies, lunged at him with their styluses, the sharp writing implements they carried. They slashed and stabbed in a panicked frenzy, so many of them that they wounded each other in the process. Ancient sources describe Caesar initially fighting back, but when he saw Brutus among his attackers, he reportedly pulled his robe over his face and uttered his famous last words in Greek, kai su, teknon. "And you, my child." Then he fell at the base of a statue of his old rival, Pompey, a moment of supreme historical irony. The scene was not one of noble liberators standing over a tyrant. It was a blood-soaked floor, senators with torn clothing, and the body of the most powerful man in the world lying in a pool of his own blood, stabbed 23 times. The liberators had achieved their goal, but in the brutal, disorganized reality of the act, they had already lost control of the story they hoped to tell. The myth of a clean, philosophical killing died there on the Senate floor, replaced by the far more powerful image of a bloody betrayal. The chaotic frenzy of that Senate floor is almost always lost in translation on the silver screen. Hollywood transforms the brutal, messy stabbing into a slow-motion ballet of betrayal. We see a circle of senators parting with solemn reverence as Caesar, played by a titan of cinema, slowly realizes his fate. The attack becomes a series of deliberate, almost ritualistic strikes. The focus narrows to a single, tragic relationship, with the camera holding on Brutus' anguished face as he delivers the final, merciful blow. This is not the historical record. This is high tragedy, a form perfected by William Shakespeare. The most famous line from that entire event, the Latin phrase et tu, brute, is almost certainly the bard's invention. The real Caesar, according to much earlier sources like the biographer Suetonius, spoke in Greek, saying kai su, teknon, which translates to "and you, my child." It is a line of profound, personal hurt, and perhaps even a curse, but it lacks the theatrical punch of Shakespeare's three-word dagger. Movies have overwhelmingly chosen the playwright's version because it is cleaner, more poetic, and instantly recognizable. It completes the arc of a tragic hero, betrayed by the one he trusted most. This cinematic choice fundamentally reshapes the meaning of the event. The historical assassination was a collective political act by dozens of men. The film version makes it a deeply personal story about the fracture between two individuals. By focusing so intensely on Brutus, the movies turn a complex political conspiracy into a simple, heartbreaking tale of a friend's betrayal. We are made to feel the personal sting of the knife over the political ramifications of the act. Why does this dramatic framing hold such power over us? Perhaps because we can more easily grasp the pain of a broken friendship than we can the abstract collapse of a 500-year-old republic. The real death of Caesar was a messy political murder that plunged the Roman world into another decade of civil war. The cinematic death is a poignant end for a great man, a moment of fallen greatness that asks us to mourn the man, not the system he broke. This final simplification raises a haunting question. After a lifetime of separating the man from the myth, where does the real Julius Caesar truly lie? Is he the brilliant, flawed architect of his own fate? Or is he forever the tragic hero that Shakespeare and Hollywood needed him to be? That same masterful control he wielded on the battlefield was first forged not with a sword, but with his voice. Julius Caesar understood that in the Roman Republic, power flowed through the spoken word. His skill as an orator was not a minor talent. It was the very bedrock of his political ascent, a weapon as potent as any legion. While we remember him for his conquests, his contemporaries were often first captivated by his speeches. He trained under the finest teachers in Rome, mastering a clear, elegant, and direct Latin style that stood in stark contrast to the ornate, flowery rhetoric popular among many senators. He aimed for clarity and impact above all else, knowing that to win over the masses, his arguments had to be understood instantly and remembered easily. He could command the Senate floor with a logical, cutting argument, and then hours later, stir the passions of a vast public gathering with a fiery, emotional appeal. This versatility was his superpower. He knew his audience, and he tailored his words like a general deploying his troops, for maximum effect in every situation. His voice became the bridge that connected the elite politics of the Senate to the raw power of the Roman street. He did not just talk to the people, he made them feel he was one of them, their champion against a corrupt and out-of-touch aristocracy. This direct connection, built word by word and speech by speech, created a popular base of support that his rivals could never match. It was this popular mandate, voiced in the roaring cheers of the crowd, that gave him the political cover to pursue his ambitious military commands in the first place. But his oratory did not end in the forum. He took his pen to war with him. His commentaries on the Gallic War are perhaps the most brilliant and enduring piece of propaganda ever written. They were not dry military dispatches sent to a dusty archive. They were gripping, serialized accounts published for the Roman public, written in that same accessible, first-person prose. He never refers to himself as Caesar, but always as he, creating an illusion of objective, third-person reporting. He portrays his campaigns as a necessary, civilized mission, his decisions as always just, and his setbacks as mere temporary obstacles overcome by his brilliance and the valor of his men. Every soldier, every citizen reading these accounts back home, was given a front-row seat to his genius. He was not just building a record, he was building a legend, with himself as the uncontested hero. This written voice won him the unwavering loyalty of his army, because he made them co-stars in his narrative of glory. They fought for Rome, yes, but they also fought for the general who celebrated their deeds and secured their riches. So when we ask how one man could command such devotion from both the mob and the military, the answer lies as much in his command of language as his command of legions. He persuaded the people to grant him power, and he persuaded his soldiers to follow him anywhere, even back across the Rubicon into civil war. This raises a final, unsettling thought. If the real Caesar was so masterful at crafting his own story, how much of the history we think we know is simply the version he wanted us to believe? That masterfully crafted voice, however, is almost never the one we hear in the cinema. The real Caesar spoke with a clear, practical elegance designed to persuade. The cinematic Caesar speaks in pronouncements, his dialogue heavy with the weight of destiny. Listen to Marlon Brando's performance in the 1953 adaptation. His voice is a low, rumbling force of nature, every line delivered as if it were being carved into stone for future generations. He does not simply address the Senate, he delivers oracles. The dialogue given to him is not the language of political persuasion. It is philosophical poetry about power and legacy, reflecting a 20th century understanding of what a great leader should sound like. This creates an aura of inevitable, godlike command, but it sacrifices the sharp, agile mind of the historical figure who used words as precise tools. A more recent portrayal, like Sciron Hinds in the series Rome, offers a different kind of power. His Caesar is quieter, more physically still, his voice a controlled, almost weary instrument. His authority comes not from booming volume, but from the chilling certainty of his whispers. When he speaks, everyone leans in, not because they are stirred by passion, but because they are afraid to miss a command. This performance brilliantly captures the effect of absolute power, the stillness at the center of the storm. Yet even here, the dialogue is refined, layered with a modern cynicism and self-awareness that the real Caesar, a product of his own time, likely did not possess. These actors use their immense vocal presence to build a monument, but the real Caesar used his to lay a foundation, brick by persuasive brick. Why does this distinction matter? Because when we hear only the pronouncements of a god-king, we stop listening for the clever arguments of the politician. We are impressed by his presence, but we are no longer persuaded by his logic. And it was that very power of persuasion that built his empire in the first place. This final layer of myth-making may be the most subtle of all, forever coloring how we hear the voice of a man who knew that words were the ultimate weapon. That masterfully controlled voice sometimes fell silent, betrayed by his own body. Behind the brilliant orator and the calculating general lay a man plagued by a mysterious and frightening condition. Historical sources, including the biographer Suetonius and the Greek historian Plutarch, recorded that Julius Caesar suffered from what they called the falling sickness. Today, we recognize the symptoms they described as epileptic seizures. Imagine the most powerful man in the Roman world suddenly losing consciousness, his body convulsing uncontrollably in public. In an era that often viewed such illnesses as a mark of divine disfavor or even madness, this was not just a private medical concern. It was a profound political vulnerability. His enemies would have seized upon any sign of physical weakness to argue that he was unfit to lead the Republic. A man who could collapse without warning could not possibly hold the reins of power. Or so the argument would go. The condition seems to have worsened later in his life, with Plutarch describing a specific episode during a battle in Cordoba, where Caesar had to be carried away from the front lines as a seizure took hold. This was not a minor inconvenience. It was a direct threat to his command, his authority, and the carefully constructed image of invincibility he had spent a lifetime building. So how did he manage this potentially catastrophic weakness? The answer lies in the ancient art of political spin. Caesar and his inner circle appear to have reframed the narrative. Instead of a shameful sickness, they may have presented these episodes as something far more formidable. In the superstitious Roman world, a sudden trance-like state or a fit could be interpreted not as an illness, but as a moment of divine inspiration, a sacred frenzy connecting him to the gods. There were stories that during these spells, he would see visions. What his opponents called a debilitating affliction, his supporters could whisper was a sign of his extraordinary nature, a spirit so powerful it sometimes overwhelmed his mortal frame. This was not merely hiding a secret. It was an act of profound image alchemy, turning a liability into a potential asset. It forces us to reconsider the man entirely. His relentless drive, his willingness to gamble everything, the burning intensity that defined his career, might they have been fueled in part by the private knowledge that his time was limited, that his body could betray him at any moment? Every decision, from crossing the Rubicon to accepting the dictatorship, takes on a new dimension when viewed through the lens of a man racing against his own physical decline. The legend presents us with a colossus of pure will. The history reveals a far more human figure, one who had to conquer not only Gaul and his rivals in the Senate, but the treacherous landscape of his own biology. That same body, which could betray him without warning, is always shown on screen as an unshakable pillar of strength. The cinematic Caesar stands tall, his voice never falters, and his hand never trembles. We see him in films like the 2002 DreamWorks animation, depicted as a broad-shouldered titan of pure muscle and will, a leader whose physical presence matches his immense power. This is not an accident of casting. It is a deliberate creative choice to erase his documented struggle with epilepsy. Filmmakers consistently present a man of iron, because that image aligns perfectly with the great man theory of history. The idea that singular, heroic individuals are the primary drivers of events. An unstoppable superhuman leader is a cleaner, more dramatic archetype than a brilliant but physically vulnerable strategist. Showing Caesar collapse in a seizure, or even alluding to it, would complicate the straightforward narrative of a colossus bestriding the world. It would introduce a note of fragility, of human limitation, that disrupts the mythic scale. Imagine if a key scene showed him delegating command because he felt an episode coming on, or recovering in his tent, weakened and vulnerable after a fit. Such a moment would be profoundly humanizing, but it would also shatter the illusion of invincibility that the great man narrative requires. The legend demands a figure who is always in control, so the inconvenient truth of his health is quietly written out of the script. This omission does more than just simplify a character. It fundamentally changes our understanding of his courage. The real Caesar's bravery was not the fearlessness of a man who believed he was untouchable. It was the far more relatable courage of a man who knew his own body was a liability, yet chose to lead from the front anyway, gambling that his mind could win the day before his flesh betrayed him. By giving us a flawless monument, Hollywood denies us the more compelling story of the flawed man who had to overcome himself as well as his enemies. His final lasting legacy was not written in blood, but in law and stone. While the drama of his assassination captures our imagination, the true measure of Caesar's impact lies in the breathtaking sweep of reforms he pushed through during his short time as dictator. In less than a year, he fundamentally rewired the Roman state, leaving behind a blueprint that would guide the empire for centuries. His most enduring gift to the world literally governs our days. The old Roman calendar was a chaotic mess, out of sync with the solar year by nearly 3 months, requiring constant political tinkering. Caesar, with the help of an Alexandrian astronomer, swept it all away. He introduced the Julian calendar, a system of 365 days with a leap year every 4. It was so precise that it remained the standard in the West for over 1600 years. This was not just an administrative tweak. It was an act of cosmic order, imposing rational control over time itself, a fitting symbol for a man who sought to bring his own kind of order to a fractured republic. His vision for Rome was equally monumental on the ground. He drafted plans for a complete overhaul of the city's infrastructure, a list of public works that reads like an ancient stimulus package. He planned to drain the pestilential marshes around Rome, to build a new, massive harbor at Ostia, and to construct a network of roads and canals across Italy. He even ordered the first systematic codification of Roman law, a project that would only be completed under his successor. But his most politically astute reforms concerned people. He settled tens of thousands of his veteran soldiers on land grants throughout the provinces, creating a loyal Romanized population far from the capital. This was a masterstroke. It rewarded the men who had bled for him, while simultaneously planting colonies of loyal citizens who would act as a bulwark for his authority and for Roman culture in distant lands. Perhaps his most radical move was his expansion of citizenship. For centuries, Roman citizenship had been a jealously guarded privilege, a marker of identity that separated the conquerors from the conquered. Caesar shattered this tradition. He granted full citizenship to entire communities in provinces like Gaul and Spain. He even placed prominent Gauls in the Roman Senate, a move that horrified the old aristocratic families who saw it as polluting their exclusive club. This was not an act of mere generosity. It was a calculated strategy to build a new power base, one loyal directly to him, beyond the petty politics of the Roman Forum. He was transforming Rome from a city-state with an empire into the capital of a unified, Mediterranean-wide nation. The assassins who killed him believed they were saving the old republic. In reality, Caesar had already moved beyond it, building the administrative and social foundations of the imperial system that would follow. His reforms asked a profound and unsettling question. Can a man who destroys a republic in order to save it from itself be called a tyrant? Or was he simply the inevitable architect of the next chapter in history? Yet that expansive vision for a new Rome is almost always reduced to a single, sinister word in the cinema: tyrant. The film industry, in its quest for a clear villain, consistently narrows Caesar's complex political legacy down to a simple story of unchecked ambition. We see him in countless productions, greedily accumulating titles and honors. His statue placed among those of the ancient kings, his image stamped on coins meant for the gods. These are presented not as the tools of a pragmatic reformer, but as the arrogant boasts of a man drunk on power, his every action framed as a step toward a crown. The focus is almost entirely on his ascent, making his eventual assassination feel like a predictable, even righteous, conclusion to a story of hubris. This cinematic lens ignores the profound popularity many of his reforms enjoyed with the common people and the army. The silver screen rarely shows us the grateful veterans farming their new lands in Gaul, or the provincial citizens who finally gained a voice in their own governance. We do not see the practical benefits of a stable calendar or the economic boom from his planned public works. These tangible improvements to daily life lack the dramatic punch of a senator brandishing a dagger. By fixating on the accumulation of personal power, movies sideline his most lasting achievement, the creation of an administrative blueprint that brought stability to a vast and fractured empire. Why does this simplification persist? Because a complex leader who did both great and terrible things is difficult to categorize. It is far easier to tell a moral fable about the dangers of ambition than it is to unravel the messy reality of a man who was simultaneously a destroyer of liberty and a visionary architect of the future. The real Caesar forces us to hold two contradictory ideas in our minds at once. The cinematic Caesar asks only that we condemn a tyrant, a final, comforting lie that protects us from the unsettling truth that the same man who broke the Republic also built the foundations of the world to come. That inner conflict between friendship and principle was embodied by one man more than any other. Marcus Junius Brutus stands as the eternal question mark of the assassination, a figure whose motives remain tangled in a web of personal debt and political idealism. His relationship with Caesar was far from simple. He was the son of Servilia, Caesar's longtime and most trusted mistress. Ancient sources even suggest that Caesar himself might have believed he was Brutus's father, though this is historically unlikely. Regardless, Caesar treated Brutus with a distinct and public favoritism, almost like a son. After Brutus fought against Caesar in the earlier civil war, he was not only pardoned, but promoted. Caesar made him governor of Gaul, a position where Brutus, ironically, grew immensely wealthy through predatory lending, charging oppressed communities exorbitant interest rates that Caesar had to intervene to cap. So here was a man deeply indebted to Caesar, both politically and financially. Yet he became the conspiracy's most prized recruit. Why? The answer lies in a philosophy, not just a grievance. Brutus was a devoted Stoic, a school of thought that prized virtue, reason, and duty to the state above all personal attachments. For a Stoic, the highest good was acting in accordance with nature and reason, which for a Roman aristocrat meant defending the republic against any form of tyranny. His own family history haunted him. He was a direct descendant of Lucius Junius Brutus, the legendary founder of the Republic who had driven out the last king of Rome. That ancestral shadow loomed over every decision. Cassius and the other conspirators did not have to convince Brutus that Caesar was a tyrant. They merely had to constantly remind him of who he was supposed to be. They flattered him, sent him anonymous messages asking, "Brutus, are you asleep?" They placed signs on his official tribunal that read, "Brutus, you are no true Brutus." This psychological pressure weaponized his own philosophy against his personal feelings. The decision to join the conspiracy was, for him, a torturous intellectual and moral calculation. He was not a man of wild ambition like Cassius. He was an intellectual trying to live up to an impossible ideal, convinced he was performing a painful but necessary duty for the good of Rome. He truly believed that killing Caesar was not murder, but the execution of a tyrant, a righteous act to restore the Republic. This is the profound tragedy of Brutus. He made the most devastating personal betrayal in history, believing with all his heart that he was doing the right thing. And in the end, his noble philosophy could not control the brutal reality he helped unleash. This noble, tormented Brutus is a direct inheritance from the stage, not from history books. William Shakespeare needed a tragic hero for his play, a man whose internal flaw was a virtue taken to a fatal extreme. In crafting that character, he gave the world a Brutus who is defined by his honor. A man so committed to the ideal of the Republic that he is agonizingly slow to act, requiring Cassius to prod and manipulate him into joining the conspiracy. We see this archetype perfected in performances like James Mason's in the 1953 film, his face a mask of pained nobility. His Brutus is a philosopher dragged reluctantly into a dirty business, his motivation pure, his hands metaphorically clean even as they hold the dagger. This portrayal is emotionally powerful. It makes his ultimate failure and suicide a moment of profound pathos, the death of a good man in a bad cause. But this Shakespearean prism drastically simplifies the far more complex and politically active figure from the historical record. The real Brutus was not a naive idealist. He was a sharp, ambitious, and deeply political animal. Before the conspiracy, he had built a formidable career. He was a moneylender on a staggering scale, one so ruthless in his dealings in Cyprus and other provinces that his interest rates sparked local revolts, forcing even his benefactor Caesar to intervene and impose a cap. This is not the behavior of a detached philosopher. This is a man deeply engaged in the cutthroat financial and political games of his time. The historical Brutus was driven by a mix of genuine republican ideology and a very personal ambition to uphold his family's legacy and his own political standing, which he saw threatened by Caesar's one-man rule. He was not Cassius's puppet. He was his partner, and his participation was the conspiracy's greatest coup, lending it an air of legitimacy it desperately needed. The cinematic version asks us to sympathize with a man torn between friendship and duty. The historical reality presents a senator weighing personal loyalty against political survival and ideological conviction. One is a timeless moral drama. The other is a gritty story of Roman power politics. By giving us the tragic hero, films provide a clear emotional through-line, but they sacrifice the unsettling ambiguity of a man who is not just honorably conflicted, but also formidably ambitious in his own right. Why is this distinction so crucial? Because the myth of the pure Brutus lets us off the hook. It allows us to believe that the Republic was killed by a noble mistake. The history suggests it was ended by a calculated political act, carried out by one of its most committed and complicated defenders. The legend of Caesar is etched into our minds by actors and artists. But what did the man actually look like? We are fortunate to have a surprising wealth of physical evidence. A collection of busts, coins, and contemporary descriptions that let us peer past the legend and meet the mortal. The most reliable portraits are the sculpted busts created during his lifetime, like the famous Tusculum bust. This is not an idealized, godlike image carved centuries later. It is a strikingly human face, thin and sharply featured, with a prominent aquiline nose. His hair is receding, combed forward in a style that does little to conceal a broad forehead. The most captivating element is the eyes, deep set and intensely focused, conveying a formidable, almost unsettling intelligence. This is not the face of a serene emperor, but of a man perpetually calculating, his mind moving faster than anyone else's in the room. This likeness is corroborated by his own coinage. Roman coins were a powerful propaganda tool, and the profiles struck during Caesar's dictatorship are remarkably consistent with the busts. They show the same distinctively long neck, the same sharp jaw, and that unmistakable receding hairline. He made no attempt to hide these features. In fact, he seems to have embraced them, allowing his image to be circulated with a raw, unflinching honesty that itself became a statement of power. He did not need the flowing locks of a Greek god. His authority was in his gaze. The historian Suetonius adds the final brushstrokes to this picture. He describes Caesar as tall and fair-skinned, with dark, keen eyes. He was, by many accounts, fastidious about his appearance, often shaving his body and being noticeably sensitive about his thinning hair. He took to wearing a laurel wreath not just as a symbol of victory, but, Suetonius suggests, to cover his baldness. This small human detail is profoundly revealing. The most powerful man in the world was not immune to vanity, to the same insecurities that plague ordinary people. This baseline of historical accuracy gives us something invaluable. It grounds the myth in a physical reality. We are not looking at a generic statue of imperial power. We are looking at a specific, recognizable man with a receding hairline and a piercing stare. A man whose very human face belied a will that could command legions and reshape the world. That strikingly human face from the ancient busts is rarely the one we see on screen. The cinematic Caesar is a product of deliberate artistic creation, where casting and makeup design forge an icon that often overrides historical accuracy. Filmmakers do not simply seek an actor who resembles the thin, balding man with a sharp nose. They look for a presence, a voice, and a face that embodies our collective idea of a world-shaking leader. Consider the stark contrast between two iconic portrayals. Charlton Heston presented a Caesar of granite-like majesty, his features classically stern, his posture ramrod straight, his voice a clarion call of command. He was less a man and more a monument, a living embodiment of imperial power that felt inherited from a bygone era of Hollywood epics. Decades later, Ciaran Hinds offered a radically different interpretation. His Caesar was rugged, grounded, and physically imposing, with a quiet, almost weary authority. This was a leader who had spent years in muddy army camps, his power earned through grit and fatigue rather than divine right. Both performances are masterful, yet both consciously prioritize a specific kind of commanding charisma over the less flattering historical portrait. The receding hairline is often minimized with clever hairstyling or wigs, the thinness of face filled out by a stronger-jawed actor. Makeup artists build not a replica, but an ideal, emphasizing the intensity of the eyes and the set of the jaw to project an aura of invincible will. These choices are not mistakes. They are essential shortcuts for visual storytelling. An audience must instantly believe that this man could command the loyalty of legions and the fear of senators. A historically precise, physically average-looking man might not convey that mythic scale within the first few seconds of his appearance. So the gaunt, balding statesman is transformed into a silver-haired titan or a battle-hardened commander. This visual elevation serves the narrative, but it also creates a lasting disconnect. We come to know Caesar through the faces of handsome, powerful movie stars, and that idealized image becomes the new truth in our mind. It begs a final, reflective question. If we were to see the real, unvarnished Caesar walk onto the screen, would we even recognize the man behind the myth? Or has Hollywood's perfect leading man forever eclipsed the flawed, brilliant, all-too-human architect of empire? That piercing stare from his coinage was part of a grand, deliberate design. Julius Caesar was not merely a subject of history. He was its most brilliant author, operating a sophisticated propaganda machine that shaped his image for both his contemporaries and for us. He understood a fundamental truth, that power resides not just in legions, but in the story people tell about you. His primary tool was his own pen. His commentaries on the Gallic War were presented as straightforward military reports, but they were, in fact, a masterwork of persuasive literature. He never uses the word I, instead referring to himself as Caesar in the third person, creating an illusion of objective, unbiased history. Every campaign is framed as a necessary defense of Roman interests, or a noble effort to bring civilization to a barbaric land. Setbacks are minimized, his decisions are always justified, and his victories are portrayed as triumphs of Roman discipline and his own personal genius. He made his soldiers the heroes of his narrative, ensuring their fierce loyalty, while presenting himself to the people back in Rome as their indispensable protector. This was not just a chronicle of events. It was a serialized epic published for popular consumption, a political campaign ad written 2,000 years before its time. But his control extended far beyond the written word. He was the first Roman to put his own living portrait on coins that circulated throughout the Republic. This was a revolutionary act. Before Caesar, Roman coinage featured gods, goddesses, or symbols of the state. By placing his own profile, complete with his receding hairline and careworn features, on the currency, he made his face more common than that of any deity. He was literally in everyone's purse, a constant physical reminder of his presence and authority. These coins often bore inscriptions celebrating his specific victories and titles, like Pontifex Maximus or High Priest, linking his political power to divine favor. He also tightly controlled the monuments and public celebrations in his honor. His triumphs, the lavish victory parades through Rome, were meticulously staged spectacles. They displayed the staggering wealth plundered from Gaul and the exotic captives paraded in chains, all designed to showcase his success as a benefactor to the Roman people. He even used his supposed mercy, his clemency, as a propaganda tool. By publicly pardoning his defeated Roman enemies, like Brutus, he cultivated an image of a magnanimous leader, a man so secure in his power that he could afford to be generous. This carefully crafted persona of the victorious general, the merciful statesman, and the divinely favored leader was a seamless whole. Every piece, from the written account to the coin in your hand, reinforced the same message. He was not just a man, he was a necessity. The terrifying genius of this system is that it was so effective. It still influences our perception of him today. We are still, in many ways, viewing Caesar through the lens he so carefully polished for himself. That relentless image-making did not end with Caesar's own propaganda machine. It simply found new architects in the film director and the screenwriter, the modern high priests of public memory. Their camera angles and script pages are the new coinage, stamping a version of Caesar that serves their story, not necessarily the history. A director crafting a political thriller will mine the sources for tension and conspiracy, framing every senatorial whisper as a prelude to assassination. They might draw heavily on the cynical, power-obsessed Caesar found in some ancient accounts, shaping a narrative of a republic suffocating under one man's ambition. Their cuts are sharp, their lighting is shadowy, and their Caesar is a master manipulator, a creature of the backroom deal. But a director aiming for Shakespearean tragedy will make entirely different choices. They will privilege the bard's play over the historical record, focusing on the personal betrayal, the tortured Brutus, and the fallen leader uttering his poetic last words. Their film becomes a character study, where the collapse of the Republic is a backdrop for a more intimate human drama. In this version, the complex economic reforms and the draining of marshes are left on the cutting room floor, deemed less cinematic than a close-up on a trembling dagger. Then there is the historical epic, a genre built on spectacle. For this director, the priority is visual grandeur. The focus shifts to the vast legions in Gaul, the burning ships in Alexandria, the marble grandeur of the Forum. This filmmaker might omit Caesar's epilepsy entirely, fearing it undermines the image of the unstoppable colossus. They choose what looks magnificent over what might be true, simplifying his multifaceted personality into a single note of heroic, or perhaps villainous, command. The screenwriter's pen performs a similar alchemy, deciding which historical sources to trust. Do they follow Caesar's own polished commentaries, accepting his version of events at face value? Or do they side with his detractors like Cicero, whose letters paint a picture of a dangerous demagogue? Each choice creates a different man. By compressing years into a 2-hour narrative, they must invent motivations, fabricate dialogue, and create emotional arcs that never existed, all in service of a clean, compelling story. We are not watching the man, but a reflection of what the storytellers, across 2,000 years, needed him to be. So where does this long journey of investigation finally leave us, standing between the legend and the ledgers? The verdict on Julius Caesar reveals a man consistently flattened by the very medium that immortalizes him. The movies give us a character driven by a singular, often tragic, ambition for power. The history uncovers a mosaic of motivations, a relentless drive fueled by political survival, a need for financial security, and a cold calculus for control that simple ambition cannot explain. His most famous alliance, the grand romance with Cleopatra, is stripped of its political engine in cinema, reduced to a mere love story when it was, in truth, a strategic merger of two brilliant minds fighting for their respective thrones. His human frailties, the epileptic seizures that threatened his command and his image, are almost universally erased from the screen, because a vulnerable hero is a harder sell than an invincible titan. And perhaps the most profound divergence lies in the focus of the narrative itself. Hollywood is captivated by his dramatic death, a slow-motion tragedy of betrayal. History is shaped by his complex life, a decades-long campaign of political innovation, ruthless reform, and administrative genius that built the framework for an empire. The cinematic Caesar is a one-dimensional tragic hero, a figure whose downfall we are meant to anticipate and mourn. The real Caesar was a far more nuanced, calculating, and politically brilliant architect. He was a man who understood that power is not just taken with a sword, but built with a pen, bought with gold, and won with the perfect, persuasive word. The myth asks us to watch a statue fall. The history challenges us to understand the flawed, formidable man who built his own pedestal, and in doing so, changed the world forever. We have walked a long road from the cold marble of the Senate to the warm glow of the silver screen. One path was paved with the gritty realities of political survival, calculated alliances, and the relentless work of administration. The other is a grand spectacle of tragic ambition, epic romance, and poetic betrayal. Both are compelling, but only one is true. The movies, in all their thrilling glory, are a brilliant refraction of history, bending the light of the past through a lens designed for drama. They give us a Caesar who is easier to understand, a character whose motives are simple, and whose story fits neatly into a three-act structure. But the real man defies such easy categorization. He was a bundle of contradictions, a man of immense personal vanity and shocking physical frailty, a destroyer of a republic who laid the foundations for an empire. To know him, you cannot simply watch the film. You must read the sources, confront the propaganda he wrote himself, and listen to the whispers of his enemies. The legend offers a satisfying story. The history presents a challenging puzzle. Having seen both sides of the coin, who do you think Julius Caesar really was? Was he the necessary architect of a new world, or the tyrant who murdered a republic? The debate has lasted for 2 millennia, and now it is your turn to join it. Let us know your verdict in the comments below. If this journey through time has changed your perspective, please like the video and subscribe for more investigations into the mysteries of the ancient world.